welcome to I Helped Make That. Today's episode is premiering right on Halloween. And for today's episode on Hallows Eve, we've got the producer of two horror classics, a horror movie and a horror comedy, one for adults, one more family friendly. I am talking to David Kirschner, the producer of the Child's Play franchise and the producer and the man behind the story of Hocus Pocus. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Kevin. Nice to be here in October,
Yep.
or be there wherever there is.
Yeah, definitely. So, David, do you mind if I just get the anchor ad out of the way?
No, please go ahead.
All right. So, if you're recording a spooky podcast, whatever it may be about, whether it is true crime, whether it is paranormal, it doesn't even have to be spooky. It can just be a regular podcast. But whatever your podcast is about, you can use Anchor because it is the easiest streaming platform to use. All you do is sign up for an account, then you can record and post on all the platforms, whether it be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. So, if you want to try having your own podcast, record on Anchor today. So, thank you again, David, for coming onto this podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about everything with you.
Yes. So, David, I got one question. I've noticed that before producing the Child's Play franchise, you were producing mostly children's entertainment. So, how'd you go from actual Child's Play to producing the movie Child's Play?
It's a very good question. I have always been fascinated by the world of children's literature, especially written in the golden age of illustration by and some of the greatest writers from uh, stories like Peter Pan to Winnie the Pooh. That's my passion, collecting first edition books on these subjects. But I'm also fascinated by what goes bump in the night. And I think that has really never changed for me since I've been a little kid. And because I've always said by day, children have the most glorious of imaginations. And by night, they have the darkest of imaginations. Of mom and dad, there's something underneath my bed. You've got to close my closet door. All the lights need to be on in my bedroom. I mean, by the way, I was that kid, and at 67, I am still that kid. My wife is enormously patient with me of things that I'm positive that I hear at night. And I don't know, I've made such a point of trying to hold on to that gift that is childhood and imagination. Uh, when Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island, he was the toast of European society, Victorian European society. And then he turned around and wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the London Times wanted to ban him from Victorian society. And then he turned around and wrote A Children's Garden of Verses. And I think Walt Disney understood this very well. If you look at any of the films, there are those moments that are terrifying in his films, surrounded by all the light and beauty. And so I think that I've really, without even knowing it, these things were very appealing to me. And the idea of complete innocence and then dark. And for me, one of the an example of that is a film that I did with Matthew McConaughey and Bill Paxton, the late great Bill Paxton, called Frailty, and it's about kids, and whose one son feels the father is a murdering crazy person, and the other son just worships their son, and that kind of brought both worlds together of kids and something very dark. And the Child's Play series has always been that as well. From the first film of the little boy in the film, the character of Andy Barclay saying, you know, Chucky is my best friend. Well, it's pretty dangerous for Madison Avenue to create a best friend for your child, as opposed to your child having a best friend that isn't just a pre-recorded voice. In that case, obviously, it's a serial killer that has hid his soul in the body of a doll. But the victim, if you will, here is the innocent boy that gets him. They keep saying, Chucky's talking to me, and Chucky is killing people around me. And, you know, everyone thinks that the kid is crazy and he's responsible for these murders. And I think that that's really what has been the foundation of that franchise being around for 35 years. I'm very proud to say we're just in our second season of Chucky. For the television series that we do. My partner Don Mancini writes and directs those, and he, from the beginning, Don was just fascinated by the idea of the darkness of someone like Chucky and just the innocence of a child, and that's why his script appealed to me so much to produce. And I created the design of Chucky. I draw, and so I created the look of Chucky as, at first, just a benign, sweet character, and then a very evil and dark presence.
Okay, and tell me, how hard was it to sell the Child's Play series to a studio?
Well, before I came on board, Don's original script was titled Blood Buddy, and by the time I heard about it, I had a deal at Disney, and I'd been in London with my wife, and I bought a book called The Victorian Dollhouse Murders. And I was just fascinated by dolls that come to life. When I was a kid, there's an episode of Twilight Zone called Talking Tina. And as a child, it terrified me. But I always remembered it. It stayed with me. And my sister's dolls, she had them on a shelf in her bedroom. And underneath that, at night, she had her nightlight. And it's like, when you put a flashlight against your face when you're a kid, just the shadows and harsh images that it makes. And I was terrified to go into my sister's room. So I've always been attracted to this world. It fascinated me and scared me. And in reading Don's script, there was a lot of many good ideas there, but there were a host of ideas that didn't work. So I bought the rights to it. I wrote up 18 pages based on Don's complete story, but changed some things and did my drawings of Chucky. And I went out with it, and where everyone passed on it originally, I had 5 studios that were bidding on it now, without showing them the screenplay, but just going with my pitch. I think a lot of that had to do with I had not too long before this, by just a matter of months, sold to Steven Spielberg An American Tail, my first film. And I just wanted to find something that was very different than an animated film. And so I was very attracted to Don's concepts. And but we had 5 studios bidding on it. But I think it was the Spielberg pixie dust that was all over me from An American Tail that really led to so many studios not wanting to let something go that where Steven Spielberg had recognized that I had some talent. And anyway, so and Don and I have been making these for 35 years. And as I said, the series is in its second season. Now, this is our first venture into television, or last year was, and this year our second season. And we're 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is staggering to me. And Don deserves all the credit for that. So, that's really how those two worlds for me come together. And I love exploring those two worlds constantly. Sometimes, we're about to do a live action Curious George. That's a very family friendly film. But I'm also developing about 6 other horror stories because they both are so, I don't know, attractive to my imagination.
Okay, now once you got the movie sold, what was your responsibilities with Dawn in the pre-production phase?
Well, there was the screenplay would be rewritten by a gentleman named John LaFia, and then by the director Tom Holland. Um, Don was not allowed on the set by the director, who was a very difficult person. Um, but once the director was let go from the film towards the end, uh, I invited Don into the editing room, and we worked together with our editor to re-edit the film and make it a good deal shorter than what the director had envisioned. He showed too much of the doll, and like Jaws or Alien, the directors in those films really wait until the right moment to show you what's underneath the tarp, so to speak, and that's really what I wanted to do with Chucky. And so it wasn't until the director was let go that we went in and cut 32 minutes out of the film.
Yeah, actually, you know, believe it or not, I just saw the first film for the first time last night, and I was honestly surprised by how late in the game it is until he comes in. I had it in my head that like he was going to be seen throughout the majority of the film. I wasn't surprised in a bad way. I was just, it's just sort of surprised, because, what's the word? Like Chucky's a very well-known and iconic character. Like even if you haven't seen the films, I'm sure most people know who he is. So you sort of just have an idea, you know, of what these films are like. And, just to see that the movie did kind of wait to show
Yes,
him was a pleasant surprise.
yes. The first film is the only one of the 7 films that we've made that that really it's kind of a slow burn, if you will. But there's a reason that film did as well as it did, and I think because it really plays with the audience and keeps them engaged and engaged. And finally, he's revealed when the mother realizes there are not batteries in his pack. If you remember that scene from last night, and it's a terrifying scene. It's a very frightening scene, and it's often used in others that have said the best moments in the history of horror and cinema, and it's an important moment. And So that's really why we really held our cards, if you will, to reveal Chucky at the right time.
Right. And now I'm just wondering when it came to creating Chucky, besides just creating the design, did you have any other input into like the actual process of building him?
No, not into the building. A very, very talented and very young at the time. I think I was 28 or 29. But the designer of the animatronic Chucky, I remember I did my drawing on paper. Kevin Yeager brought Chucky to life and was the maestro, if you will, of with all of his puppeteers of making Chucky work, um, and is a brilliant engineer of being able to build something like this. I wouldn't know how to do that for anything in my life. Um, so there were an awful lot of talented people that came together, starting with Don Mancini, but a lot of talented people that came together to create Chucky and to bring him to life.
Yeah, and as the producer and as Don as the producer, did you have any input in who got hired to help make the movie?
Oh yes, I mean Don was not a producer on that film. He was just he wrote the original screenplay, and he shares screenplay credit with two other writers. Um, and it wasn't until Bride of Chucky, which is Chucky #4, that Don said to me, David, I think I'm ready to direct. And I said, Don, we haven't been on a set together completely. Let's do this. Why don't I make you a producer? You're there all the time when we shoot up in Toronto. I live in Los Angeles, as does Don. Why don't you come up and be a part of the entire process from beginning to end? And he was an incredible executive producer. When our director left because he didn't want to edit the film, Don and I and our other partner Corey Cienega we all worked together to edit that film, and that film did very, very well, and was an awful lot of fun, and introduced a romance for Chucky, which was, of course, the Bride of Chucky, which is Jennifer Tilly, who's so much fun.
Okay. Now, I'm also curious. The first movie was produced by MGM, but I know the sequels were produced by Universal Pictures. So, what happened there exactly?
Kevin, it's such an interesting and actually exciting story. Uh, we did the first film. The studio, I think, was completely shocked as to the degree of its success. And they said almost immediately, David, we want a sequel. Great. I went to Don and said, start thinking of a sequel to this. And Don began to work on something. We presented it to the studio. They loved it. Don got the green light, started to write, and we started to move into pre-production very quickly. And then I got called into the chairman's office of United Artists, and they said to me, and he was a very nice man named Richard Berger, and Richard said to me, David, I don't know how to say this to you, but we can't make Child's Play 2. And I said, why? And he said, because there is a company that is a man that's going to be buying this company, and he doesn't want to make movies like that. He wants to make Disney movies. Well, this guy would wind up going to jail for fraud. The deal never happened, but they gave it back to me free and clear. And because I had made An American Tail with Steven Spielberg, Steven called me and said, listen, Universal really wants this movie. If you would do me the favor of just bringing it to them first with your wish list, and if they can't give you what you want, then you can walk away. But please do me that favor, which of course, I mean, I owe my entire career to Steven Spielberg. Yes, I would do that in a second. But they did make my deal, and it worked out very, very well. And that's how it went from Universal to United Artists. And it was Steven Spielberg that made that happen, which is astounding to me still, 30 some odd years later.
Wow, that's really cool. But speaking of Disney, now let's shift our focus to Hocus Pocus. So, when you first started developing Hocus Pocus, were you still at Disney?
No, I was, what had happened, we'll go back in a little time machine here. In 1984, I presented An American Tail to Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was head of the Disney studio, and specific to features. And I presented An American Tail to him, and he passed on it. And that was the end of that. And then after Spielberg bought it, I think Jeffrey Katzenberg felt like, oh my God, I missed the boat here. How did I not see this? If Spielberg wants this. And I got a call from them saying, is there anything else that you would like to sit down with us? Is there another movie you'd like to make? And I said, well, there is this story that has started off as a as just a tale for our two daughters that then kind of grew into a bedtime story in October of a group of kids that let the genie out of the bottle, so to speak, with three goofy witches. And he said, "Well, come in and pitch that." So I went to Disney. I asked him if he could give me 2 weeks, and he said, "But don't take it anywhere else." And I said, "No, I won't. But but if I could get into the conference room a half an hour early, I'd just like to set up some things." So he said, "Great." So I took those 2 weeks that I asked for because I had no art. Everything I do has art to it, or what are called maquettes, sculptures of characters. And what happened was that I wanted to create Halloween. I wanted to recreate their childhood version of Halloween, the executives. And what I did was I bought a contemporary broomstick, a contemporary mop, and then I had a Electrolux vacuum cleaner, the engine hollowed out, taken, removed, and I hung all of them on monofilament wires hanging from the ceiling in the conference room. I then took a bag that my wife bought or just from the market, and our kids were too little at that point to do drawings that really would look like anything other than scribbles. So my wife Liz had all the kids in the neighborhood draw on this bag a black cat, witches, broomsticks, um, just all kinds of Halloweeny things. And then she bought about 15 pounds of candy corn. And because nothing smells like your childhood like candy corn, right? I mean, there's just such a wonderful hug to your senses with candy corn. And anyway, I tore the bottom of the bag and I made a serpentine design for where the executives were going to sit. And when they walked in, they went and sat down and they smelled their childhood. And what I said is that Halloween at that point is $1 billion business. Today it's a $10 billion business, but almost 30 years ago when this was presented, it was just a $1 billion business. And I think that on top of the Spielberg of it all, really added to Jeffrey Katzenberg's interest in the fact that there were no family movies out there for Halloween. And so that's how Hocus Pocus really, the beginning of it, that's how it started.
Okay, so once you pitched it to them, what were the next steps after that?
There were many writers, Kevin, that came in. There were altogether about 20 writers that would do various versions. It would take us 9 years to get Hocus Pocus made. And finally, we were able to get well, it really starts with Bette Midler, because Bette Midler was on top of the world in 1992, which is when we were starting to make the film. And Disney had a deal with her, and they said, "How would you like to play this really horrible witch, but it's a comedy?" And she was thrilled by the idea of it. And then Disney had made a film called Newsies with a young, talented director named Kenny Ortega. Kenny not only did Newsies and Hocus Pocus, but he did High School Musical. He did Descendants for Disney. I mean, just a really, really talented man. He had been a choreographer for Michael Jackson, for Madonna, for Broadway shows, and he just brought all that with him to first Newsies and then Hocus Pocus. And again, I just want to remind you and your audience that Hocus Pocus was a bomb when it came out. We got bad reviews. No one came to see it. And about 5 years later, Disney decided to throw it onto the Disney Channel. And because they needed some programming for Halloween, they didn't think much of it. But the numbers were really good. And so they did it again, and the numbers grew, and they kept growing. And over 5 years, it grew into an enormous success, or was well on its way. And I mean, today it is the number one family movie for Halloween. Uh, it's going to Broadway. It's a it's an amazing show in Florida. Um, you know, it's really become something. And now we've just released Hocus Pocus 2, and with Bette Midler and Sarah Jessica Parker and Kathy Najimy, and different director and Fletcher, and she did an amazing job directing it. But it's a really fun film, and it debuted on Disney Plus as the most watched film Disney has ever had, beating Encanto, beating anything Star Wars, beating the Marvel Universe or Pixar or Disney Animation. And I'm sure in time, someone else will beat us, but it makes me feel pretty good for a film that really bombed when it first came out.
Yeah, and I think the reason it might have, well, at least partially the reason it might have bombed is it came out in July. Were you surprised that they decided to release it during the summer?
I not only was I surprised, I was furious. It's a Halloween movie. It's a you put on a nice comfortable sweater and you turn on the fireplace and you watch Hocus Pocus. I mean, why would anybody release a film like this in July? But I don't think they really believed in it. And Tim Burton's brilliant film Nightmare Before Christmas was made around the same time, and I think they went with that. And that film was released in October, and it didn't do great either, but it got great reviews. And that since has gone on to become the classic that it deserves to be. It would take us a lot more years than it took them. But that said, I believe we've eclipsed them now with the number one family Halloween movie of all time.
Yeah. Now, I was curious. So, one thing I noticed about Hocus Pocus it is, and this is a very stark contrast against last week's episode, which is Carrie, is that it's about teenagers, but they're played by actual teenagers. Yet, most of the movie takes place at night. Do you know how they were able to, so how do I say this? Like get around child labor laws, or how child labor laws, how they were able to use child labor laws, or like I'm just kind of curious about that whole.
I know your question is a very good one. And what happens is that, well, first of all, a lot of it is interior aside from exteriors at night. So interiors you could shoot during the middle of the day, right?
Mhm.
But the night shoots, um, the kids don't show up until much later in the day. They have to go to school for a little while, school on the set.
Mhm.
They have to get their education the same way as if they were in school, like normal kids. And so that's how we're able to shoot through the night with some of those. But still, if you're a teenager, unless you're under 18, you cannot work as long as an adult. And we are, I mean, a studio like Disney, but a producer, creator like myself, I would never go around child labor laws. I have never done that, and I
Mhm.
haven't done it in my near 45-year career, and would never do that. It's just like animal abuse to me is the same. It's just not stuff that you do. I know there are people that do some bad things,
Mhm.
but if you're dealing with the major studios, they don't play around. Uh,
Mhm.
they 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 want it absolutely upfront, and so that everyone can see what is going on, and that kids are safe, animals are safe.
Mhm. Yeah, actually, that's kind of interesting for both movies because they both have like children in them. Like back to Child's Play, you had a kid who was doing a not very kid friendly movie. So how do you know like how they were able to prep him for that?
Uh, yes, his mother was always on set.
Mm-hmm.
Um, his teacher um, and social worker were always on set. And there was a discussion with he and his mother as to what was happening in that film. There's times that he had to act very, very frightened. There were other times that we would shoot around him so that um, he would not see some of the things that were that were shot for an R-rated film. So that's how we really got around that. But look, there are times over the years that we've done a scene with just Chucky talking, and a kid said that would be no problem. It would be no problem. Their parents said it would not be a problem. And once they got a chance to see Chucky beginning to move and his facial expressions and all the puppeteers that are making that happen that are kind of hidden away, they were terrified. So that has at times shut down filming when a child does get frightened, and you just have to explain. And that's why we always try to show the kids how the dolls work. Just what makes Chucky tick, and that these are moms and dads that are puppeteers that are making this work. And we really try to make it a really family friendly atmosphere. I've bought bicycles and toys for kids so that in between the moments that they're shooting, they can see, or they can be a kid in between those shots and ride their bike around and play. And usually the crews are always so wonderful with kids. Almost everything I make has to do with childhood. I just love exploring childhood in all different forms, from very dark, like a Chucky movie or Frailty, to Curious George or An American Tale. Um, there's just so many different versions that I do, and Hocus Pocus falls into a little bit of both. I always joke and say it's your child's first tiny little horror film, but it's really not a horror film. I mean, it's really it's a comedy about three bumbling witches, but
Mm-hmm.
they are sucking the lives out of children on All Hallows Eve, and that's why the kids have to put the genie back in the bottle and get them vanquished before they're able to complete their spell, which is to suck the lives out of all the children of Salem. Which may sound very dark to you, but if you look at anything, if you look at Cinderella, if you look at uh, uh, gosh, Sleeping Beauty. I mean, a potion to make you sleep forever with the pricking of your finger on the needle of a loom. There are very dark moments. Look at Bambi, where you don't
Mm-hmm.
see it, but you hear a gunshot, and then you hear Bambi say, "Mother," and you just see birds fly up. And I mean, Disney was amazing at that. If you look at Lion King, when uh, Simba watches his father fall from the cliff because his evil uncle Scar has pushed him, and you see him fall to his death. He watches his father fall to his death,
Mm-hmm.
and in the Grimm stories and children's fairy tales, this was always the case. Little Red Riding Hood. Um, Even the Little Mermaid, the Disney version is quite sweet, but the original version is rather dark. So it has always been a staple of storytelling within children's tales. This darker element. I just try to do it in the most fun way possible.
Okay. And also, actually, speaking of children, in Hocus Pocus, the little girl, Denny, was played by Thora Birch. And unfortunately, as you may know, her father has sort of a had a reputation as sort of a difficult on-set manager. Was that true on this film?
I never met her father. I only met her mother,
Mm-hmm.
who was very nice, but I never met her father. And yeah, so I couldn't tell you, but I never, there was no father around when she made it, just the mom.
Okay. All right. And actually, you God, I was gonna. All right, so that wasn't a problem then. But oh yeah, actually about Hocus Pocus, I heard that Leonardo DiCaprio was originally going to play the boy Max.
He came in for a reading of it and passed on the production, and that's how Omri Katz got the job to play Max Dennison. I mean, no one knew uh, who Leonardo really was at that point. He wasn't Leonardo at that point. He was just, a very adorable young teenager. I think he had done Gilbert Grape, but I think that's it. He had certainly not done Titanic yet. So yes, that's very true.
Okay, thank you for confirming that legend, but just out of curiosity, when do you think you first not sorry, when not when do you think, when did you first hear that Hocus Pocus had gained a cult following?
Well, the first time that I realized it, my daughter Jessie had a friend over, and she said, "Show my dad, show my dad." And her friend said, "No, no, no, no." And I said, what is it?" Her name is Lauren. And what is it? And she said, "Well, I love Hocus Pocus so much." And I said, "Oh, thank you." And Jessie said, "Do it for my dad." And she said, "Okay." And she proceeded to rattle off like 5 pages of dialogue of all the characters. And she said, "I love this movie. I've watched it truly 1,000 times on the VHS back in the day." And it made me think, God, I wonder if there are other Laurens out there like this that feel this way about the movie. But I really didn't know. It was really before the internet was anything. So I had no idea. But it was, as I said, it was about 5 years later when I started seeing the numbers from Disney that they would send me as to the amount of households they were getting that were watching Hocus Pocus. And it seemed endless as to the amounts of people that just were watching it and rewatching it and rewatching it. And it just kept growing. And so that's really what brought it. But at the 20th anniversary, Disney decided, because things had really grown so big, they decided to do a little advertisement, and they would have a screening for some fans at the studio. Well, within 10 minutes, Kevin, that entire giant theater sold out. And Disney thought, all right, you know what? We'll throw another screening up there and see what happens. Within 10 minutes, sold out. And I think that said to them, something is really going on here. And so, and for the 20th anniversary, all these fans that came dressed as the Sanderson sisters. And this was in the time that you couldn't go online and buy a costume. There weren't any. People were just making them. And or the character of Billy Butcherson, the very sweet zombie that keeps losing his head in the movie, but he's very sweet. People were dressing as Billy Butcherson, the zombie. And then Disney started to, they have a gorgeous theater in Los Angeles here called the El Capitan. That's an old theater from the late 20s, just a gorgeous Art Deco theater. And they started to show the movie in October. And at first it started with 2 screenings, and then they would sell out. So they would add another and another. And today it's 13 days of Hocus Pocus at the El Capitan in Hollywood, and people dress up. They come. It's like Rocky Horror Picture Show. People just go crazy as to being a part of this. And by the way, you could stay home and watch it for free, but people pay, and it's not inexpensive. It's like 20 some odd dollars per person to go to this, and yet, and also now at the 25th anniversary, Disney rented out a cemetery, and they built an enormous stage, and they filmed a special for Hocus Pocus, and and they allowed 2,500 people into the cemetery. Well, 5,700 people were turned away. I mean, that's all the cemetery would hold. And Disney put on this extravagant show in October, and it was amazing. Kenny Ortega, the director, hosted it, and it ran on the Disney channels. And it was just a celebration of the 25th anniversary. Next October, a year from now, it will be the 30th anniversary of Hocus Pocus.
Well, yeah, and not only that, but I was at a dog parade today, and they've had costumes of both Chucky and Hocus Pocus there. There were dogs wearing like Chucky costumes and Hocus Pocus costumes. Though back to Child's Play, even though that was more of an instant hit than Hocus Pocus was, I did find it interesting that the first movie came out in 88, the second movie came out in 1990, the third movie came out in 1991, and then there was a 7-year gap before Bride of Chucky. What was with the 7-year gap?
The third film was not received well. It just, I think it's the weakest. Probably there's two for me that are the weakest. It's Child's Play 3 and Seed of Chucky, which is his son. So I think Universal thought it's dead, it's over. And Don and I went in and presented Bride of Chucky to them, but they passed on it. But about 4 or 5 months later, they came back to us, and even though they passed on it, the head of the studio said, "David, this is so weird." He called me and said, "David, this is so weird. My daughter has just discovered horror, and she's been going to all these sleepovers with her girlfriends. She's 14, and they love the Chucky movies. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Let's move forward with Bride of Chucky." So it took a 14-year-old girl, daughter of this head of the studio, to make this happen for us. Don and I couldn't make it happen, but this girl saying, "Dad, I love Chucky." The dad said, "Oh, you know what? I was just pitched one of those." She said, "Oh, Dad, you should make another one of these. All my friends and I love them." And that was all it took. And that one became enormously successful. Don did a fantastic job of writing that.
Yeah, so it seems like even though they are tonally very different movies, it seems like more fan demand that is causing both of these series to go on, even when the studios originally thought they were dead in the water.
Well, Kevin, over the years, because both of these movies are almost 30 years old and 35 years old, people that were 15, 12 when they saw the first Chucky or the first Hocus Pocus are now well into parenthood, and they have their kids. And I call it the Barbie ethic. But whether it's Chucky or whether it's Hocus Pocus, they want to share with their kids the experience they had. Now with Chucky, obviously, that's not for little kids and kids usually under 14 or 15. But Hocus Pocus certainly is that. And that's why I call it the Barbie ethic, or Hot Wheels ethic, because moms and dads that had those toys as kids love buying them today. Mattel understood that and really, really made a point of advertising to those parents so that they would buy the toys for their kids. And I think that's exactly what has happened with Hocus Pocus and Chucky.
Yeah, and this is very true for many, franchises in general that are still,
Star Wars for sure.
yeah,
James Bond.
or just like any reboot nowadays. It's like, it's parents wanting to share it with their kids. Like, speaking of Hocus Pocus, which is from Disney, Disney does that all the time, and they have been doing that all the time for decades.
Right. But it wasn't, because this film had failed so badly. For the last 10 years, I've been trying to get the sequel made. And my screenwriting partner Blake Sheldon, Blake, Blake Harris and I said Blake Shelton, Blake Harris and I um, wrote a pitch of this and presented it to Disney, but it would take 10 years for them to finally move forward with it until they were positive that it was worth spending the kind of money they did. And they spent a lot of money on this film. The first one was about 26 million to make. This film was somewhere around 84 million to make. So they gave us a lot more money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess just before we leave, for both films, like, and I know you said that you weren't heavily involved in the puppetry, but how about for Hocus Pocus? Were you involved in the effects for that?
Well, I wasn't involved in the puppetry. That's something that I don't have skills for.
Mm-hmm.
I created the look of Chucky. Kevin Yeager brought him to life,
Mm-hmm.
and he is truly Dr. Frankenstein, if you will. He's the one that really made the monster breathe literally and move his eyebrows and move his eyes
Mm-hmm.
and his mouth so and on Hocus Pocus, I did a lot of drawing of elements to it. The black flame candle. I
Mm-hmm.
have the original one right here, and book. I have both of those. If you want me to grab them and show them for your audience.
Yeah, that would be cool if you could.
Okay, let me grab that 1 second.
Okay.
Okay. So here is the black flame candle.
Whoa.
And this is Liz, my wife, found a candle at the market because I had asked her to buy me one, and then I bought some paper. You can see just like it's just a normal candle there.
Mm-hmm.
And I bought some paper. I put it in the oven and toasted it to make it look like ancient parchment. And then I took kind of a sepia oxbloody looking color and made an ink and started to do all these drawings of kind of witchy images that I took from different books
Mm-hmm.
and and took Latin and wrote all over the candle. And then my friend Robin Lynn made this for me based on a drawing I had done of book and the way that I wanted book to look. Uh, and this is an old science book
Mm-hmm.
that was never returned to high school, but this was part of the presentation for Disney, so they could see all of this as to what was in my imagination. And so I really, and this was part of the presentation with the broomstick and the mop and the Electrolux vacuum cleaner that was in the room when the Disney executives came in. I don't like to leave to chance people interpreting something that might be in my imagination. And
Mm-hmm.
things, whatever it is I create, they only get better because of the other talented people in these films. They bring it to another whole level. And I'm very fortunate to work with so many really talented people. But at least I can convey what it is that I'm talking about, so an executive could really see it.
All right. Wow, that was really cool. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, David.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me. Your questions have been really interesting and thought provoking for me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again. And before we leave, do you have anything to plug?
Uh, to plug, the next property is we're doing a live action Curious George, and
Mhm.
that will be out in well, we start shooting hopefully if all goes well in spring of this coming next year. So it's live action. The only thing that's not live action is George, and he will look like an adorable chimp. But all the other parts are live action, and it's going to be a very exciting movie.
Okay, great. Anyway, that was I Help Make That, and I'll see you all.
I put a spell on you.